Deep in the misty Blue Ridge Mountains, where ancient pines stand sentinel and nature follows its own unforgiving rules, a simple act of compassion was about to change two lives forever. A man, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug, breathed deeply, relishing the peace he had spent decades earning. But nature had different plans. That faint, desperate cry carried on the morning breeze wasn't just another forest sound. Following the sound, he found a shivering bobcat kitten, weak, abandoned, and fighting impossible odds. For this small, cloudy-eyed bobcat kitten, the man was either its last hope or merely a witness to its inevitable fate. What do you do when the wilderness leaves its most vulnerable directly in your path? This is a story about boundaries crossed, between wild and tame, between helping and letting go. And sometimes, when you save a life, you have no idea what might be waiting for you in return. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The morning fog lingered among the tall pines of the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting the forest in a dreamy haze as Martin Mantis Henderson took his first sip of coffee on the cabin porch. At 58, with salt and pepper hair and weathered hands that had spent decades crafting fine furniture, Mantis had finally allowed himself this 2-week retreat away from his workshop in rural Virginia. His younger brother, Dale, was joining him later that day, and together they planned to fish, hike, and simply enjoy the tranquility that had eluded them both during their busy working lives. 6 months planning this getaway, Mantis murmured to himself, stretching his legs and admiring the view. The cabin, nestled in a clearing surrounded by ancient oaks and maples, provided a perfect vantage point to observe the wilderness. As a lifelong woodworker, Mantis felt a special connection to these forests, appreciating the very material that had sustained his livelihood and passion for so many years. He was about to return inside when he heard it, a faint, pitiful sound carried on the morning breeze. At first, he thought it might be a bird, but something about the cry seemed more desperate, more urgent. Mantis set down his mug and cocked his head, listening intently. There it was again, a weak, mewling cry that tugged at his heartstrings. Slipping on his boots and grabbing a flashlight despite the morning light, Mantis descended the porch steps and followed the sound toward a dense patch of underbrush about 50 yards from the cabin. As he drew closer, the cries became more distinct but no less feeble. Carefully pushing aside a tangle of brambles, Mantis discovered the source of the distress, a tiny, trembling bobcat kitten no larger than his hand. "Well, hello there, little one," he whispered, crouching down for a better look. The kitten's condition was alarming. Its ribs protruded sharply beneath a dull, matted coat. One of its back legs appeared injured, and most concerning were its eyes, cloudy, unfocused, and weeping with infection. The kitten shrank back at the sound of Mantis' voice, but lacked the strength to flee. When it attempted to hiss, the sound emerged as little more than a raspy wheeze. Mantis quickly removed his flannel shirt, leaving him in his undershirt despite the morning chill. With practice, gentleness developed through years of handling delicate wood, he carefully wrapped the kitten in the soft fabric. The poor creature barely struggled, a testament to its weakened state. "Where's your mama, little bobcat?" Mantis wondered aloud, scanning the surrounding area for signs of an adult bobcat. Finding none, he concluded what he had feared. This kitten had been abandoned, either intentionally by a mother who recognized it wouldn't survive, or because something had happened to the mother herself. Back at the cabin, Mantis placed the bundled kitten in a cardboard box lined with a towel and immediately reached for his phone. The closest town was Asheville, about an hour's drive away, and he hoped there would be a veterinarian who could help. After several calls, he connected with Dr. Eliza Wilder, a wildlife veterinarian associated with the Carolina Wildlife Conservation Center. I'd say bring the kitten in immediately, but from what you're describing, it might not survive the journey, Dr. Wilder explained after Mantis detailed the kitten's condition. I can meet you halfway. There's a gas station off Highway 26, Miller's Stop. I can be there in 30 minutes. I'll head out now, Mantis agreed, already gathering his keys and wallet. Just as he was about to leave, his brother Dale's truck rumbled up the gravel drive. Dale, 5 years younger than Mantis, but with the same sturdy build and thoughtful eyes, emerged from the vehicle with a cooler in one hand and a fishing rod in the other. Caught you trying to sneak off fishing without me? Dale joked, then noticed the concern on his brother's face. What's wrong? Mantis quickly explained the situation, showing Dale the weakened kitten. Mart, that's a wild animal, Dale cautioned, using his brother's given name. Even if you could save it, what then? It's not a house cat. I know that, Mantis replied, gently adjusting the towel around the trembling creature. But I can't just let it die, not when there's a chance. Dale sighed, recognizing the familiar determination in his brother's eyes. The same look Mantis had when he insisted on caring for their mother during her final months battling cancer, or when he'd spent countless nights rebuilding his workshop after a devastating fire. All right then, Dale conceded, setting down his gear. I'll drive. You keep that little wildcat comfortable. Dr. Eliza Wilder was younger than Mantis had expected, probably in her mid-30s, with short-cropped black hair and alert brown eyes that immediately focused on the box in Mantis' arms as he approached her vehicle at Miller's Stop. Let me see, she said without preamble, gently taking the box and placing it on the hood of her Subaru. With practiced efficiency, she examined the kitten, her expression growing more concerned as she checked its eyes. Male Bobcat, probably about 6 weeks old, she murmured, administering a small injection that she explained was an antibiotic. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, infected eyes, and yes, I'm concerned about the vision. The infection has progressed significantly. Will he make it? Mantis asked. Dr. Wilder straightened up, fixing Mantis with a direct gaze. I want to be honest with you, Mr. Henderson. The odds aren't good. This little one would normally go to our rehabilitation center. But in this condition, she paused. He needs around-the-clock care for at least the next 72 hours. Feeding every 3 hours, medication administration, temperature monitoring. Dale stepped forward. We can take him to the center if that's best. Actually, Dr. Wilder said, surprising them both. I think moving him again could be too stressful. Are you willing to care for him at your cabin for a few days? I can provide everything you need and specific instructions. Once he's stabilized, we can reassess. Mantis didn't hesitate. Of course, whatever it takes. Dr. Wilder nodded, seemingly satisfied with his response. I'll follow you back to your cabin with supplies. We'll set up a proper care station, and I'll show you exactly what to do. During the drive back, Dale gave his brother a sideways glance. You realize our fishing trip just turned into a Bobcat nursery operation, right? Mantis smiled slightly, one hand resting protectively on the box. Life has a funny way of changing plans. The next 48 hours were a blur of activity. Dr. Wilder stayed for several hours that first day, teaching the brothers how to prepare the special formula for infant wild felines, demonstrating the proper feeding technique using a small syringe, and showing them how to administer the various medications for the kitten's infections and pain. Eye infections like this are particularly dangerous, she explained, carefully applying medicated drops to the kitten's cloudy eyes. Bobcats rely heavily on their vision for hunting. If the damage is permanent, she didn't need to finish the thought. Before leaving, she helped them create a proper recovery space in a quiet corner of the cabin. A large plastic storage container lined with soft blankets, a heating pad beneath one half to allow the kitten to regulate its own temperature, and a small stuffed animal that Mantis had found in the cabin's storage closet, left behind by a previous visitor's child. Call me anytime, day or night, Dr. Wilder instructed, handing Mantis her card with her personal cell number. The next 72 hours are critical. If he makes it through that, we have a fighting chance. That night, Mantis set his alarm for every 3 hours. At each feeding, he gently woke the kitten, who would initially hiss weakly before accepting the nourishment. Dale took the daytime shifts, allowing his brother to catch up on sleep. Still don't know why you're knocking yourself out for a wild animal, Dale commented on the second day, though his tone lacked conviction as he gently stroked the kitten's back with one finger. Mantis observed his brother's gentle interaction with the bobcat and smiled knowingly, but said nothing. By the third day, the kitten, whom they had started calling Skunky due to a distinctive stripe pattern on his forehead that reminded them of a skunk, showed small but encouraging signs of improvement. He was taking more formula at each feeding, his breathing seemed less labored, and the infection around his eyes appeared slightly less inflamed. Dr. Wilder visited again on the fourth day, bringing more supplies and examining Skunky thoroughly. He's responding to the antibiotics, which is excellent, she confirmed, her expression cautiously optimistic. His weight has improved slightly too, but I'm still concerned about his eyes. She performed several visual tests, moving her finger in front of Skunky's face, shining a small penlight near his eyes, and observing his reactions. The lack of response confirmed their fears. The infection has caused significant damage, she explained gently. I believe he's nearly or completely blind. Even if we save him, he can never be released back into the wild. Mantis felt his heart sink. What happens to him then? Dr. Wilder sighed. Normally, in cases of permanent disability, we have to make difficult decisions. A blind predator cannot survive in the wild, and our rehabilitation center has limited resources for permanent residents. You mean he would be euthanized? Dale said bluntly. Dr. Wilder nodded reluctantly. That is often the most humane option for wild animals with severe disabilities. There must be another way, Mantis insisted, watching as Skunky nestled against the stuffed animal in his enclosure, his tiny body finally relaxed in sleep. Well, Dr. Wilder said hesitantly, there are rare exceptions. Some wildlife education centers accept disabled native animals for their educational programs. And in very special circumstances, there are permits available for private individuals with proper facilities and experience to care for non-releasable wildlife. But those are extremely difficult to obtain, and the requirements are stringent. Mantis was quiet for a moment, thinking, what would those requirements entail, exactly? As the days passed, Skunky continued to improve physically. His coat began to regain some luster, his strength increased, and the infection gradually cleared, though, as expected, his vision did not return. Dr. Wilder confirmed that he was completely blind in his right eye and had only minimal light perception in his left. What was most remarkable, however, was how Skunky began to adapt. He started to navigate his enclosure using his other senses, particularly his hearing and whiskers. Mantis noticed how the kitten would cock his head, listening intently to locate the source of sounds. By the end of the first week, Skunky had memorized the layout of his enclosure and could move around with surprising confidence. He's compensating, Dr. Wilder explained during a phone consultation. Young animals are incredibly adaptable. Their brains can rewire to enhance other senses when one is lost. Mantis began experimenting with sound cues, a soft whistle before feeding time, a gentle tap on the floor when approaching, different vocal tones for different activities. Skunky quickly learned to associate these sounds with specific events, responding appropriately each time. He's smarter than half the contractors I've worked with, Mantis joked to Dale, who had become equally invested in Skunky's care despite his initial skepticism. By the 10th day of their vacation, which had transformed entirely from a fishing retreat into a wildlife rehabilitation mission, Mantis had made a decision. He spent hours on the phone with wildlife authorities, researching requirements, and consulting with Dr. Wilder about the possibility of becoming Skunky's permanent caretaker. The requirements are substantial, he told Dale one evening as they watched Skunky tentatively exploring a larger enclosure they had built in the cabin's living room. I need to modify my property, get special permits, undergo training, regular veterinary checkups, proper dietary plans. It's essentially transforming part of my home into a wildlife sanctuary. Dale watched his brother's face carefully. You're really considering this, aren't you? Manny's nodded. I've been thinking about scaling back my furniture business anyway. Maybe taking on fewer custom pieces, focusing on teaching woodworking instead of production. This feels like, I don't know, the right next chapter somehow. Dale smiled, understanding. Since his brother's divorce 5 years earlier, Mantis had thrown himself into his work, crafting beautiful furniture pieces that were sought after throughout Virginia and beyond, but often at the expense of his own well-being. This Bobcat kitten had awakened something in his brother that had been dormant for too long, a sense of purpose beyond work, a connection to something wild and real. Well, Dale said, clapping his brother on the shoulder, if anyone can turn their home into a Bobcat sanctuary, it's you. And I suppose I could help with some of the construction when I'm off duty. Dale, a firefighter in Richmond, had always been handy with tools himself, though not with his brother's artistic finesse. The final days of their vacation were spent making arrangements. Dr. Wilder connected Mantis with wildlife officials who could guide him through the permit process. She also introduced him to a wildlife rehabilitator in Virginia who had experience with blind predators and could serve as a mentor. It won't be easy, she warned during her final visit to check on Skunky before the brothers departed. Bobcats, even hand-raised ones, retain their wild instincts. As he matures, he'll become more challenging to manage. And with his disability, he'll need constant environmental consistency and enrichment. I understand, Mantis assured her, watching as Skunky batted playfully at a feather toy Dale was dangling above his enclosure. But I think we've already formed a connection. He trusts me. Dr. Wilder smiled, observing the gentle way Skunky leaned into Mantis' hand when he stroked the kitten's back. Yes, I believe he does. That's rare and special with a wild animal, especially a solitary species like a bobcat. The journey back to Virginia was carefully planned. They constructed a special travel crate that would keep Skunky secure and comfortable during the 6-hour drive. Dr. Wilder provided sedatives to reduce the stress of travel, though they ended up using only a minimal dose, as Skunky remained surprisingly calm throughout the journey, particularly when he could hear Mantis' voice nearby. Upon arriving home, Mantis immediately set to work preparing a temporary indoor enclosure in his spare bedroom, while plans for a proper outdoor facility were developed. His modest craftsman-style home sat on 3 acres of wooded land, plenty of space for an appropriate enclosure that would give Skunky a semblance of a natural environment while keeping him safe. The permit process was as rigorous as expected. There were multiple inspections, mountains of paperwork, and several courses Mantis needed to complete on wildlife care and management. Dr. Wilder provided crucial documentation about Skunky's condition and her professional assessment that he was non-releasable due to his blindness. Throughout these challenging weeks, Skunky continued to thrive under Mandy's care. By now nearly 12 weeks old, he had grown significantly, though he remained smaller than typical for his age due to his rough start in life. His personality emerged more each day, playful and curious in the mornings, dignity and quiet observation in the afternoons, and surprising affection in the evenings when he would often curl up near Mantis as he worked on sketches for furniture designs or read. Mantis became fascinated with bobcat behavior, devouring books and online resources about the species. He learned that wild bobcats were primarily solitary, territorial animals that typically avoided human contact. Yet Skunky, perhaps due to his early rescue and blindness, displayed behaviors that seemed to blend wild instinct with domesticated comfort. He's in a category all his own, remarked Dr. Carl Lawson, the local exotic animal veterinarian who had taken over Skunky's care. Not wild, not tame, but somewhere in between, and entirely dependent on you because of his disability. This unique relationship became increasingly apparent as Skunky matured. He maintained typical Bobcat behaviors, scent marking his territory, practicing pouncing techniques, and occasionally letting out impressive growls when startled. But he also developed behaviors that seemed specifically adapted to his life with Mantis. Most remarkably, Skunky learned to follow the sound of Mantis' footsteps throughout the house, tracking him from room to room with uncanny accuracy. He developed different vocalizations to communicate his needs, a chirping sound when hungry, a low rumble when he wanted attention, and a distinctive trill when playing with his favorite toys. By the time 6 months had passed since the rescue, Mantis had completed the necessary requirements and received his special wildlife rehabilitation permit. With Dale's help during his days off, they constructed a spacious outdoor enclosure connected to the house via a specially designed Bobcat door that only Skunky could use with his microchip collar. The enclosure featured natural elements like logs, rocks, and native plants, along with climbing structures that Mantis crafted himself. Most importantly, it was designed with Skunky's blindness in mind. Consistent placement of features, textured pathways that helped him navigate by feel, and sound elements like a small recirculating stream that provided auditory landmarks. As Skunky approached his first birthday, he had grown into a stunning, if somewhat undersized, Bobcat. His coat gleamed with health, his muscles were sleek and powerful, and to anyone who didn't know better, his blindness wasn't immediately apparent thanks to his remarkable adaptations. Word of Mantis' unusual charge spread throughout the community. Initially reluctant to share his story, Mantis eventually began accepting visitors, mostly local schoolchildren and wildlife enthusiasts, who came to learn about bobcats and the importance of wildlife conservation. Skunky, seemingly sensing the educational importance of these visits, displayed a surprising tolerance for small groups, often positioning himself prominently on a favorite perch where visitors could observe him safely. "He's become an ambassador," Dale remarked during one such visit, watching as his brother patiently explained bobcat habitat needs to a group of wide-eyed fourth graders. For his species and for second chances. One crisp autumn morning, about 14 months after the rescue, Mantis awoke before dawn as usual. He made his coffee and settled into his favorite chair near the glass doors that overlooked the backyard and Skunky's enclosure. In the faint pre-dawn light, he could make out Skunky's form on one of the elevated platforms, seemingly at alert. Something about the bobcat's posture struck Mantis as unusual. Typically, Skunky would be completing his night patrol at this hour, marking his territory before settling in for a morning nap. Instead, he sat perfectly still, facing the forest edge beyond his enclosure with intense focus. Unusual for an animal with such limited vision. Curious, Mantis quietly opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The cool morning air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Mantis noticed what had captured Skunky's attention. At the forest edge, partially concealed by underbrush, stood a wild female bobcat. Mantis froze, hardly daring to breathe. While bobcats weren't uncommon in the area, they were rarely seen, their elusive nature keeping them hidden from human observation. This one, a healthy adult female with distinctive ear tufts and watchful yellow eyes, seemed equally interested in Skunky. For several minutes, the wild bobcat remained at the edge of the clearing, occasionally taking a few steps closer before retreating again. Skunky remained motionless on his platform, nose working overtime to capture the scent of his wild counterpart. Finally, the female bobcat melted back into the forest as silently as she had appeared. Only then did Skunky relax his posture, turning his head toward the sound of Mantis breathing as if suddenly aware of his presence. "You sensed her somehow, didn't you?" Mantis murmured, approaching the enclosure. Skunky chirped in response, rubbing against the wire mesh as Mantis reached through to stroke his favorite spot behind the ears. That evening, Mantis called Dr. Lawson to share the experience. "It's not entirely surprising," she explained. "Even with his vision impairment, his other senses are incredibly acute. He would have smelled and heard her long before you noticed her presence." But why would a wild bobcat approach like that? Mantis wondered. Curiosity, perhaps, or territorial investigation. Bobcats are highly territorial, and she may have been aware of Skunky's presence for some time. She paused. It's also breeding season. The thought hadn't occurred to Mantis. "Oh, don't worry," Dr. Lawson assured him with a laugh. "Your enclosure is secure, but don't be surprised if she returns. Wildlife often establishes routines, especially around reliable food sources and interesting stimuli." Sure enough, over the next few weeks, the female bobcat made several appearances at dawn and dusk. Mantis began calling her Shadow for her ghost-like ability to appear and disappear silently. Each time, Skunky would detect her presence before Mantis did, assuming the same alert posture on his platform. Fascinated by this development, Mantis set up a wildlife camera to capture these interactions. The footage revealed something remarkable. Shadow would often bring small prey items, a squirrel, a rabbit, once even a duck, and leave them near the enclosure before departing. "It's gift-giving behavior," Dr. Lawson explained, examining the footage with amazement. "Highly unusual between unrelated adult bobcats. She's either trying to establish a potential mating relationship, despite the barrier, or..." She hesitated. "Or what?" Mantis prompted. This might sound far-fetched, but she could be trying to provide for him. Animals sometimes recognize disability in others of their kind. There have been documented cases of wild animals bringing food to injured members of their species. Mantis considered this, remembering how easily he himself had responded to Skunky's vulnerability that morning in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Maybe compassion crosses more boundaries than we realize. Winter arrived with unusual intensity that year. Heavy snowfalls blanketed the region, and temperatures plummeted to record lows. Mantis added extra heating elements to Skunky's enclosure and monitored him closely. Though the bobcat seemed to revel in the cold, his winter coat thick and luxurious. Shadow's visits became less frequent as the weather worsened, though the wildlife camera occasionally captured her passing through the property, leaving distinctive paw prints in the snow. Mantis found himself worrying about her during particularly harsh storms, wondering how wild bobcats weathered such conditions. One night, as a blizzard raged outside with wind gusts strong enough to rattle the windows, Mantis was awakened by Skunky's distinctive alarm call, a sharp, urgent vocalization the bobcat rarely used. Grabbing his flashlight, Mantis made his way to the back door. The beam of light cut through the swirling snow, illuminating Skunky pacing anxiously along the edge of his enclosure closest to the forest. Following the direction of the bobcat's attention, Mantis swept the flashlight beam toward the trees and caught a glimpse of movement near a fallen log. There was Shadow, huddled against the trunk, barely visible through the driving snow. Something seemed wrong with her movement. She appeared to be limping severely, one front paw held off the ground. Without hesitation, Mantis pulled on his heaviest coat and boots. He knew approaching a wild bobcat was dangerous, particularly an injured one, but the temperature had dropped below zero, and in her compromised state, Shadow would not survive the night in these conditions. Moving slowly through the knee-deep snow, Mantis approached the injured bobcat, speaking in the same soft, reassuring tones he used with Skunky. Shadow watched him warily, ears flattened, but made no attempt to flee. Whether from trust or inability, Mantis couldn't tell. As he drew closer, he could see the problem. Her front paw was caught in a small trap, likely set illegally by someone hunting on the outskirts of his property. The sight filled him with anger, but he focused on the immediate need. Using his gloved hands and a small tool he kept in his coat pocket, Mantis carefully worked to release the mechanism. Shadow remained surprisingly calm throughout the process, though she hissed in pain when the trap finally released. The paw was injured but not severely damaged. The trap had been small, possibly intended for muskrats or similar prey. Once freed, Mantis expected Shadow to bolt for the woods, injured paw or not. Instead, she limped a few feet away and then stopped, looking back at him with what seemed like uncertainty. "You can't stay out here," Mantis told her, knowing full well the foolishness of trying to bring a wild bobcat indoors. Yet the alternative was leaving her to certain death in the storm. Making a quick decision, Mantis returned to the house and retrieved a large pet carrier from the storage shed, part of the equipment he'd acquired for Skunky's veterinary visits. He also grabbed a blanket and some of the raw meat he kept frozen for Skunky's meals. Back outside, Shadow had moved closer to Skunky's enclosure, the two bobcats regarding each other through the wire mesh, their noses almost touching. It was this surprising tableau that gave Mantis an idea. Instead of trying to coax Shadow into the carrier, he opened a rarely used maintenance door on Skunky's enclosure, a separate section that could be closed off from the main area, designed for safely cleaning the enclosure when in necessary. "This is either brilliance or madness," he muttered to himself as he placed the meat inside this segregated area and backed away. Whether drawn by the food, shelter from the storm, or Skunky's familiar presence, Shadow eventually limped into the sectioned-off portion of the enclosure. Mantis quickly secured the outer door, then closed the interior divider, creating a separate but adjacent space for the injured bobcat. Through the night, Mantis monitored the unusual arrangement from the house. The wildlife camera, which he had repositioned to view the interior of the enclosure, showed the two bobcats lying on either side of the wire divider, occasionally touching noses through the mesh. At first light, despite the continuing storm, Mantis called Dr. Lawson. "You have a wild bobcat in your enclosure," she repeated incredulously after he explained the situation. "Deliberately. She was injured, caught in a trap. I couldn't leave her in the blizzard," Mantis defended. "What should I do now?" There was a long pause. "Keep the divider closed. Don't interact with her directly. She's not Skunky. I'll be there as soon as the roads are passable to examine her paw. If it's not a severe injury, we'll treat and release her once the weather improves." It took 2 days for the roads to clear enough for Dr. Lawson to reach Mantis' property. During that time, Shadow remained surprisingly calm in her sectioned area, accepting food left by Mantis and seeming to take comfort in Skunky's presence on the other side of the divider. Dr. Lawson arrived with tranquilizer equipment and medical supplies, prepared for a difficult examination of a terrified wild animal. To everyone's surprise, Shadow required only minimal sedation, allowing them to treat her injured paw with relative ease. "The damage is mostly superficial," Dr. Lawson confirmed, bandaging the paw. "Some bruising and minor lacerations, but no broken bones or tendon damage. She's incredibly lucky." She paused, observing how even in her sedated state, Shadow positioned herself to maintain visual contact with Skunky. "And this behavior is fascinating. I've never seen anything like it between adult bobcats that aren't related." Once Shadow had fully recovered from the sedation, the plan was to open the outer door of her section and allow her to leave when she chose. But nature had other ideas. Another storm system moved in, keeping Shadow in the relative comfort of the enclosure for several more days. During this extended stay, Mantis observed the deepening connection between the two bobcats. They would play a version of chase along the divider, sleep pressed against opposite sides of the mesh, and even share food. Shadow once pushing a portion of her rabbit through a small gap to Skunky's side, an unprecedented behavior that left Mantis and Dr. Lawson, who reviewed the camera footage, speechless. "It's like she knows he's disadvantaged," Dr. Lawson remarked. "This contradicts nearly everything we understand about solitary predator behavior." When the weather finally cleared a week later, Mantis opened the outer door of Shadow's section as planned. To his surprise, she made no immediate move to leave. She explored the opening, ventured out briefly, but returned to the enclosure before nightfall. This pattern continued for several days. Shadow would leave for increasingly longer periods, but always return, usually bringing small prey that she would share with Skunky through the divider. It was as if she had established the enclosure as part of her territory, with Skunky as an unusual companion. After consulting with wildlife authorities and obtaining special permission, Mantis and Dr. Lawson decided on an unorthodox arrangement. They modified the enclosure to include a one-way entrance that would allow Shadow to come and go freely while preventing other wildlife from entering. The divider between the sections remained, protecting both Skunky and Shadow, giving her the freedom her wild nature required while allowing the remarkable relationship between the Bobcats to continue. Spring arrived with an explosion of new growth and activity. Shadow's comings and goings became a regular part of life at Mantis' property. She would disappear for days at a time, then return to spend hours or sometimes overnight in her section of the enclosure. Mantis continued his educational programs, now occasionally featuring Shadow when she happened to be present, teaching visitors about the differences between wild bobcats and those raised in captivity due to disability. The uniqueness of their story attracted attention from local conservation groups, who provided additional resources and support for Mantis' growing wildlife education initiatives. One warm May morning, Mantis awoke to an unusual sound from the enclosure. Checking the wildlife camera feed on his phone, he was stunned by what he saw. Shadow had returned overnight, but she hadn't come alone. Following behind her, tumbling and playing in their mother's footsteps, were two tiny bobcat kittens. She brought her babies to meet him, Dale said with wonder when Mantis called to share the extraordinary development. She trusts you both that much. Over the following weeks, Shadow continued to bring her kittens to the enclosure regularly. Under her watchful eye, they would play along the divider while Skunky watched with apparent fascination from his side. Sometimes, when the kittens were napping, Shadow would position herself by the mesh where Skunky could reach through and groom her face. The two adult bobcats sharing a quiet communion that transcended the boundaries between wild and captive, disabled and whole. One evening, as Mantis sat on his porch watching this unusual blended family, Dr. Lawson joined him after completing Skunky's quarterly examination. In 30 years of wildlife medicine, I've never seen anything like this, she admitted, gesturing toward the enclosure where Skunky was gently batting at a stick one of the kittens was pushing through the mesh. By all conventional wisdom, none of this should be happening. A blind bobcat shouldn't be thriving like he is. A wild female shouldn't be voluntarily associating with an enclosure. And she certainly shouldn't be bringing her kittens here. Mantis smiled, thinking back to that morning in the Blue Ridge Mountains when he'd found a tiny, suffering creature that everyone said couldn't be saved. Maybe conventional wisdom doesn't account for exceptions. Or for compassion, Dr. Lawson added thoughtfully. Yours changed Skunky's life. Maybe his changed Shadow's perception of what's possible. And now they're both changing ours. As if hearing his name, Skunky turned toward the porch, his sightless eyes somehow finding Mantis with unerring accuracy. The bobcat made the special chirping sound he reserved only for his human caretaker, the same sound Mantis had first heard in the underbrush that fateful morning. It struck Mantis then, watching Shadow gently guide her kittens through their play, that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness created ripples that extended far beyond their original intent. His simple decision to help one suffering creature had expanded into this extraordinary arrangement. A blind bobcat serving as an ambassador for conservation, a wild mother finding an unusual ally in her challenging world, and himself discovering a purpose that had eluded him for years. The unexpected surprise, Mantis murmured, remembering how he'd once planned nothing more ambitious for his life than crafting beautiful furniture and fishing with his brother. Now he found himself at the center of something far more meaningful, a unique bridge between the human and natural worlds, built on a foundation of compassion and trust. As twilight deepened into night, the kittens curled up against their mother, who stretched out along the divider where Skunky could maintain contact with her through the mesh. Mantis remained on the porch long after Dr. Lawson had departed, witnessing this tableau of unlikely connection and feeling profoundly grateful for the twisted path that had led him here, to this moment, this night, this unexpected family that had formed around an act of kindness in the wilderness.